Hello there. On February 7th morning, we saw a flash flood in the Ganga River in the mountainous state of Uttarakhand. Now, this flash flood may have been caused because of an avalanche that caused a massive block of snow and mud and earth to smash into the river. And in the last 48 hours, the media that we've seen has done quite an excellent job on chronicling the rescue effort. But this is climate change we're talking about, and nothing about it is easy to report. Is the media equipped really to report the full story well? To talk about this, we have a distinguished panel of three people. The first is Joydeep Gupta of the Third Pole. And I understand the Third Pole refers to the Tibetan Plateau. And we'll talk about what that means as well. We also have Jacob Koshy, who's a deputy science editor of The Hindu. And finally, we have Bahar Dutt, an independent journalist, someone people in the television space know very well. She's an associate professor at Shiv Nadar University, where she teaches media and climate change. Thanks very much for joining us. Joydeep, my first question is to you. In your piece on the Third Pole, you mentioned that there were temperatures in January has been at the highest in the last 6 odd decades. And, a big piece of snow broke off and then it went down and smashed into the river. The question I want to ask you is, and it comes up again and again, is this a natural disaster? Because someone told me that there is no such thing as a natural disaster anymore.
Well, there are certain disasters that are still natural. An earthquake would be one, or a volcanic eruption would be one, but definitely not these caused by climate change. These are definitely due to human-caused climate change. We still don't know because the scientists are still getting to the spot and we're still talking on the basis of satellite images only. So we still don't know how and why that particular huge, massive piece of ice fell, and exactly where it fell, whether it fell straight into the river or whether it fell into a lake that in turn led to the Rishiganga River. We don't know. What we do know is that one of two things happened. Either the ice itself, the whole chunk itself broke off because of the melting, especially within the glacier due to a very warm January compared to what it should be, or, and this is something that a globally well-known landslide expert of the Himalayas, Dr. Dave Petley, has been saying, or near the Trishul peak itself, the rock itself split. And that also, Dr. Petley says, is probably due to climate change because of the very rapid cooling and warming of rocks, which, as you know, that cracks rocks, especially in an icy area. Either way, we have climate change causing this huge flash flood. We have climate that is a direct consequence in this case. Then there is the added thing, the impact of the flash flood. And that has been worsened very, very significantly by very poorly planned dams, roads on the way of the flash flood.
Got it. So essentially you're saying, if I'm not putting words in your mouth, that yes, this is definitely human made. We don't know exactly what caused it. There are some intelligent guesses we can take until we get more information. And if not the cause, the impact was also exacerbated because of man-made reasons. Bahar, I want to ask you about what you've seen of the coverage so far. It's been 48 hours. And you and I go back to television news. In fact, I remember in 2012, when the Uttarakhand flash floods happened, I was very much in television, and I saw how much reporters tried so very hard to get into these extremely remote places. And television really is made for these kind of stories. But at this point in time, would you say television is doing its job?
Well, Venkatesh, first of all, I'd just like to say I'm so angry right now. I'm just angry because this happened in 2013 and it's happening again in 2021. I mean, as if, India didn't have, we already have a pandemic, we have a farmers' protest going on, and now this. And it's almost like we've become so casual about human lives. So I mean, I'll come to the, how the media is reporting on it in a bit, but I'm just so sickened by the tragedy which has happened where people have lost their lives, all for just, I'm not going to call this even climate change. I'm just going to call it a man-made disaster. Because time and again, committee after committee has said that we should not be having hydropower dams. We should not be having 4-lane, expressways being built in the mountains. And even as you and I are speaking, there are hundreds of people trapped inside that tunnel, and we don't know if they're going to come out. So that's the anger is that. Now you asked me about the media. I don't think the media is doing a good job. Yes, I mean, we all know that the media anyways is in a state of crisis, but I think that the reporters who are there on the ground are focusing on the rescue efforts. Why is nobody going to the chief minister and asking him that when there were curbs put on these hydropower dams, why were they functioning? Is there any record of the number of labor employed? Were they following the law? None of these questions are being asked. And we are so focused on this one tunnel. And yes, I know the lives are important. Lives right now need to be saved. But our jobs as journalists, as reporters on the ground, also has to be about questioning the system and its policies. So yes. I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, yeah, that's an important point that, there's so many reporters, and we have reporters focusing on chronicling the actual disaster, which is extremely important, and they're doing that. But the accountability aspect of it is not being addressed. Jacob, the Hindu is very famously a sober broadsheet, a newspaper. These are the cliches attached to the Hindu. But it's a fact that when it comes to TV, print is much more expansive. It can devote much more resources to finding out what the story behind the story is. But would you say that print is doing its job?
By and large, I would say that print is doing its job. And why I would say this, that, for example, just on February 8th, for instance, just the papers that appear on February 8th, it already had, a sense of analysis regarding, was this really something called a glacial lake outburst flooding? Was it an avalanche-related, issue? And there was already dispute among different kinds of scientists, because some scientists say there's no glacial lake. We've tracked satellite images and not seen, glacial, any evidence of lakes. So there is already this dissent that I thought was captured by at least a few newspapers, at least, the prominent newspapers in English, at least. And I really haven't had a chance to go beyond the English media per se. But however, that said, as you did point out that, papers do take this kind of reporting to an extent more seriously, by the simple reason that, you would have probably noticed that there are multiple reporters writing about this issue. I mean, for example, in my own newspaper, there are a couple of my colleagues who are focused entirely on the disaster management, the tunnel rescue, these operations that are primarily now directed in some way from the Home Ministry, and talking about what is the disaster response force doing, etc. I personally haven't really delved into that. I mean, all my stories in the last couple of days since this is broken has exclusively been about scientists, finding different kinds of scientists, what are the different kind of theories, and I expect what I know today, I'm pretty sure would be entirely upturned by tomorrow. And this is experience that again comes from reporting on science and environment, because we all know, I mean, when you've been working, and COVID was a perfect example, because until day before yesterday I was only looking at COVID for the last year and a half. I mean, it was just RNA and vaccines and epidemics and epidemiology, and now I have again had to changing focus onto this. So there is an element of becoming expert quickly within within a few hours on an entirely highly technical topic. But on the whole, I see this pattern there in other print newspapers too, at least. I mean, there are multiple journalists on it. There are people on the science beat in general who are generally on the science beat. But I really don't see many people on the science beat in television papers. I mean, there's no real dedicated science and environment person who only is covering that all through the year. Of course, when something involves life tragedy like this, yes, everybody wants to converge on the on the hotspot and report the disaster. As you said, it makes great television, but there is no real consistent person who is only looking at science, environment, and I think that expertise comes up in print, and these are the times when it comes out, when you actually want to read newspapers to understand and read from people who have the privilege or have the opportunity to just focus on science and environment and health, consistently.
I'm going to ask you, Jacob, a little while later, what to expect in the coming days. And it's also worth pointing out that Bahar Dutt was an environmental journalist with that as her exclusive beat for several years, but that's in the past.
Yes.
Joydeep,
I really don't see anybody else who's actually taken those mantles, and even in the other, in the other.
We were all asked to get lost, if I may. Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, I mean, we were most of the environment journalists were asked to leave because
exactly
the model of
it's a tough beat. I mean, it requires a great deal of specialized knowledge like other science and health reporting. Joydeep, I have this book. This is the one that's kind of like my guiding post, The Uninhabitable Earth. You all know this book, and the reason I picked it up was I haven't finished the whole book. I've read about half, but there's one thing that kind of stood out for me. We've talked about chronicling the disaster response. We've talked about accountability journalism. I want to ask about the whole storytelling aspect, especially when it comes to, climate change. How do we tell the story of climate change? And there is a line in there that says something like, we are mesmerized by the threat, which is directly in our faces, but we are not perceiving it clearly. Can you kind of cast a little bit of light on that?
The only way to do that is exactly the same as for any good reportage, to put a human face on it. To see how it affects your audiences, and that the basics of good journalism doesn't change whether you're doing science reporting, environment reporting, climate reporting, or sports reporting. The basics don't change. So put a human face on it. I can tell you the kind of climate stories that get maximum audience, the kind of climate stories that have been getting maximum audience, and we do track this in recent years, has been along India's coast, where the coming in of saline water is affecting people's health directly. So when it affects your audience's health, then people are going to take notice. That's the story that people need to do. Very similarly in this case, this is a case of that science reporters, environment reporters have been writing, reporting for months, saying, look, the glaciers are retreating at a dangerous pace. They have been writing this for years. They have been quoting scientists on this for years. And they have been saying it in so many words that that flash flood is a very serious and imminent danger. So be careful. So now when a flash flood comes, what happens? You find that it has initially come and hit a small hydroelectric power station, which against all its norms, and these are questions that people on the site, on the spot could ask. Did that the first Rishiganga HEP, hydroelectric power station, have an alarm system? It is obliged, it's mandated to have an alarm system. Did it have one? The Tapovan one, the second one, where the tunnel where all the reporters are right now, that's a huge one. If the people there, they are downstream of what happened earlier, and I have got eyewitness reports from there saying, and which we have quoted, saying that one of the major problems that they had in the second hydroelectric power station spot is that huge chunks of concrete from the upstream power station came and hit them, because the flash flood pulled out all the concrete from the upstream power station. This is the danger of making a whole cascade of dams. We have been writing about this,
right?
And and it's not as if we have not been. It's not been pointed out. So the problem is not with the messenger. The problem is that people in the positions of policy making are refusing to take the message for whatever reason.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. Bahar, I want to bring you in on that. Do you think there's an element of fear or kind of self-censorship? Yes, there are strictures and restraints on the media to openly question certain things, but there's also the case of whether it comes to individual journalists. Is there some kind of fear or self-censorship that comes into play as well? Because as Joydeep was saying, there is not much wrong with the messenger. There's a problem with the recipient of the message.
Of course, I mean, that is part of the problem. But Venkatesh, just to go back a little, I know that while you're trying to give this the lens of should we report on climate change enough, I actually want to say that forget climate change, because, it's very easy to just say, for reporters to say, oh, we're not trained to ask, to deal with climate change. So that absolves them of their responsibility. And I'm saying what we need right now is pure investigative journalism. What we need is somebody to question that the contractor lobby, which was operating there in the Himalayas, I need somebody to question that. And I find that no media house is doing that. So my frustration is that. And regarding, is there a fear? Of course, there is a fear of asking such questions. And yes, we live at a time where if you ask these questions, you have an ED raid against you. So,
yes,
of course, people are self-censoring. But then I find even the digital media, which is otherwise quite bold, and which could ask those questions, is not asking those questions right now of our politicians, of the officers on the ground. As Joydeep pointed out, why was no warning signal going? I don't want to get into this, did the glacier melt or did the avalanche come? I don't want to know that, because I spoke to 5 scientists for the article I did for the Quint, and all those 5 scientists on record said to me that this disaster could have been stopped if those powerhouses or the thermal power, the power plants, the hydro power plants that were there, if they had set off a warning signal, if they were following the strictures laid down by the courts, if they were not dumping the debris in the river. That is, please remember, that is what is clogging the tunnel right now, because all the mountain rubble that they've been excavating is being dumped in the river, and that's what slid down and blocked that tunnel. So I'm just uneasy with that.
Yes, so there are 100. Yeah, the message I'm taking from what you're saying is there are hundreds of such stories just within this disaster alone that have gone unreported. So whether it's the contractor lobby or a lobby related to anything else, wherever there's a money trail, there's a lobby, there's corruption, and I suppose that a lot of this would have been something that local news would have been well equipped to kind of handle, but we don't know what kind of local news there is really beyond what we see already. Jacob, what are going to be the downstream effects, not of this disaster, but of the journalism? Are we going to forget it? Because I get the sense that newspapers, they have this way of dealing with disaster by commissioning a lot of reporting, obviously, analysis, and then opinion, and then it kind of dies out. Opinion follows news and analysis, and maybe there'll be one follow-up. So do you see this story, like all the other stories, dying out downstream?
I would expect so, because, but again, it's just a matter of time. I would imagine television would first stop it once the visuals are done with, once people have been rescued, or there's some finiteness in the terms of the number of people who are dead or not. But I would imagine the print medium and online medium, people who are on the many nice great websites that we have now, they would sustain it for a while, and there would be a larger climate change angle on this. And I speak from experience, because I believe in 2018, I was writing about the Ganga. I mean, there was a lot of protests regarding a proposed Ganga bill, and there was a scientist turned hermit, Professor G.D. Agrawal, a veteran environmentalist, and he was on a 100-day fast, and asking, and one of his demands was this, that several hydroelectric power projects on the Alaknanda and on Bhagirathi, they ought to be done away with. And this there were a lot of hermits on serial fasts, and I'd actually gone to several of these project sites, to examine what was happening and to just get a sense of what people were talking about this. And there was all of these concerns are not new. I mean, even Joydeep would know and Bahar would know. I mean, we've been writing on this for a long time. The essential concerns regarding dams haven't really changed. But it was only when after Professor G.D. Agrawal died, and then it turned out to be it turned out to be a political issue. Then after which the government suddenly came up with a host of ordinances wherein they said, okay, no more new projects, but the existing ones will go on, and they put restrictions on the amount of water, a minimum amount of water that all hydroelectric projects upstream must deal with. And after some time, that Ganga issue has completely gone. There is now the Uttarakhand Char Dham project. That's again another environmental issue in the making, waiting for its own branded disaster that is yet to form. But in the last year, we've only seen COVID, and COVID itself is a perfect example of the many sub-stories regarding there is climate involved in that, there is disease, there is human hubris. All of those things are combined in them. So I would imagine this too would go into the news cycle, as we call it, but it is up to dedicated newsrooms to continue to have reporters who are able to furnish attention consistently and wait for those new news breaks. And once they come, along with investigation and reporting, try to so-called push the story forward such that these issues are continually played in the public mind, so to say.
Yes. And one of the things, as taking from what you said, this show is called Media Buddhi. So I just want to wrap it up and to talk about what do we need to keep this topic alive. Yes, we understand there's a real constraint on resources when it comes to newspapers, TV channels, news websites, and so on. But as we wrap up this conversation, I'm going to start with Joydeep and then come to each of you. Is there any one thing that people need to keep in mind? What questions should we be asking as regular people who don't perhaps follow the news as closely? But when it comes to anything, today it's the Uttarakhand floods, tomorrow it's probably going to be something else. Everything is kind of connected to that climate change word, which is very, very polarizing, as we know. So what is that one thing that we should all keep in mind? Joydeep, I want to start with you and then Bahar and Jacob.
Well, I don't know if you find the climate change phrase polarizing, whether you find it polarizing or not. Let me make a forecast, which I've been making now for at least 10 years. Climate change is the largest and biggest story of the century, of this century. I'm not interested in it because I'm a scientist or an activist or anything. I'm interested in it purely as a journalist, because it's already affecting every aspect of our lives and the lives of our audiences. As you can see, whether it's politics, whether it's health, whether it's business, security, every beat is being affected by climate change. So we can't get away from it. And the earlier we get our heads around it and all newsrooms get their heads around it, the better.
Great. Bahar? Bahar, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm saying that I think newsrooms around the world have accepted that climate change is a real story. They've changed the terminology as well. The Guardian now refers to it as the climate crisis. And I think the moment you do that, you kind of accept that it's happening now. The challenge in the past used to be that it's going to happen in 2030, it's going to happen in 2050. And even when I teach my students at the university, I say that, look, the taxonomy needs to change, the terminology needs to change. We refer to it now as the climate crisis. And I just want to end on a positive note, Venkatesh, because I fundamentally believe in the power of media. And so I'd like to give the example of the tsunami, where the tsunami happened, but now we are so equipped to deal with something like the tsunami that we are able to herd people and take them to safe shelters. We've changed our policy to some extent when it comes to the coastline, and I think the media did have a role to play in this, that we've been able to save lives. So can we do the same for the fragile ecology of the Himalayas, and of course for which as Joydeep rightly said, is going to be the biggest story of our times, climate change. So we call it the climate crisis. We accept that it's now and it's going to impact all of us.
Yes, it's interesting you said that, Bahar, because from climate change, we are now calling it climate crisis. I know that people are using the term climate emergency as well. So it's interesting how these terms evolve and how we reframe the way we look at this challenge. Jacob, the last word is for you.
Well, I really don't have a fundamentally new point, but I would just essentially encompass it as more boots on the ground in terms of journalists. I mean, like I said earlier, I mean, print has a relative advantage because it continues to maintain on its roles, dedicated science, environment, and health journalists, sometimes all three different, who only report on various aspects of these and throughout the year. And it's at certain times, it's in times like these that the benefits of investing in, in such beats actually come by. And but television, all said and done, video is a very, very powerful medium. I mean, yes, print can have all its expertise, but there is something that that the visual media that captures it in a way that really captures the public imagination. And I believe unless and until there are more reporters who are like Bahar, who were dedicatedly on beats like these, it's only investments like that can actually generate more stories, can lead to the right kind of public awareness and the questioning that ultimately will come, which will ultimately have a kind of political impact. I mean, politicians must, or bureaucrats who actually think of or who frame everything in the language of development, must answer questions about ecology, development, and that awareness can come only if there is a certain amount of public pressure, and that can only come from more sustained media efforts on these lines.
Yes, the phrase "more boots on the ground" is something that's echoing for me from what you said. Thanks so much, all three of you, and it's been a real pleasure because these conversations are quite radicalizing in that one learns so much. And it was a real pleasure to talk to all of you. Those of you who are watching this, please go and check out the thirdpole.net. It's quite a nice website. It's just quite a pleasure to read it aesthetically as well. And the Hindu, of course, I think digital all access is something like 1,199 the last time I checked. So please do that. Yeah. And also please look out for Bahar Dutt's stories and teachings wherever she may roam. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Venkatesh. Bye.